That morning, I wasn't in a rush to get to work. The sky was clear, the sea was calm. It felt like a late summer day in the middle of autumn. It wasn't Istanbul, but that city, with its coastal charm, felt more like a seaside town. Taking the ferry to work was the most peaceful moment of the day. My father was with me. Since his retirement, I'd been trying to spend more time with him. But most of the time, his silence didn't allow me to bridge the gap between us. He was a man who preferred thinking over speaking, a man who had seen war, experienced loss, but never fully told his story. We boarded the ferry. The upper deck was empty. As always, my father sat on one of the benches by the railing. As I sat beside him, my eyes caught the man sitting across from us. Gray coat, face wrinkled by the wind, eyes lost in the distance. He was old, but sat upright. No one sat with him. He seemed to have taken refuge in the calmness of that hour. But there was something about him, a familiarity I couldn't quite place. Then my father gently touched my arm. He had turned his head toward the man. His eyes were fixed, his face frozen. His lips parted, but no words came out. Then in a whisper he asked, "Do you see that man over there?" I nodded. Without looking away, my father continued. He reminded me of Raymond. Raymond, I'd never heard that name before. It must have been one of the friends he lost in the war, but it was a name he had never once mentioned. Just as I was about to ask, he stood up and slowly began walking toward the man across from us. My eyes followed every step. It was like he had stepped into a time capsule. Each heavy but determined footfall carried the weight of years. He sat beside the man. The man turned to him. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then, without saying a word, they both turned toward the sea. And in that moment, I understood. That ferry wasn't just a means of transportation that morning. It had carried us into the middle of an untold story from years ago. And I had begun witnessing a part of my father's past I had never known. For a while, neither of them said a word. They sat quietly, surrounded by the hum of the ferry engine, the cries of seagulls, and the soft lapping of the water. I watched from a distance. Something inside me whispered that this moment was precious, though I didn't yet understand why. My father's shoulders trembled slightly, but it wasn't from the cold. It felt more like the sting of a suppressed emotion. Eventually, my father turned his head and said something to the man beside him, in a low, almost hesitant voice. The man looked at him. His eyes slowly widened. "Raymond?" my father asked. The man didn't react at first. He just stared. And in that look was the weight of years, a face caught between recognition and disbelief. Then he lowered his head, resting his hands on his knees. "I never thought I'd hear you say that," he said. My father's eyes had filled with tears, but he didn't cry. He simply took a deep breath. "I thought you were dead," he said. "That night, Biwam, when we didn't hear anything, we always believed you were gone." Raymond slowly laced his fingers together. "I thought you had made it out," he replied. "But after the explosion, I woke up in another camp. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even remember who I was. Not for a long time. Something inside me broke with those words. The weight my father had carried. His silence. Those moments when his mind drifted far away. It all suddenly made sense. Raymond wasn't just a war companion. He was a piece of the past that had been buried, a story left untold." My father leaned a little closer. "For years I spoke to your grave," Addie said. "I asked you to forgive me. I didn't know that you were still alive." Raymond looked up. His eyes were now clear. "I prayed every night that someone was looking for me," he said. "But no one came, so I learned to stay quiet." In that moment, the two men clasped each other's hands tightly. The ferry moved forward at the same pace, but time had stopped. I couldn't move from where I sat, because I was witnessing a man come face to face with his past, and a quiet ferry ride had just rekindled a friendship silenced by decades. As the ferry approached Katakoy, the sun peeked gently through the clouds. A thin shimmer formed over the water. And under that light, two elderly men shared the burdens they had carried for decades on separate shores of their lives, now side by side on the same bench. I was still watching them from a distance, but I could clearly see the change in my father's eyes. He wasn't looking at an old friend. He was looking at a time he had lost. Raymond leaned back slightly. "I never imagined you were still here," he said. After all these years, in this city, sitting across from me on a ferry, it doesn't feel like a coincidence. My father nodded. Maybe some coincidences, he said, are just time's conscience. They bring us face to face, so we have to confront what we've buried. I slowly walked toward them. When my father saw me, he gave a small nod. I sat beside them. Raymond turned to me. His eyes scanned my face for a moment. You, what was your name again? My name is Evan, I said. My father used to mention someone named Raymond. He never gave details, but every time he said your name, his eyes would change. When I saw you today, something stirred inside me. Raymond smiled. I know you from photographs. I had one of you and your father at a train station when you were little. I carried it in my pocket for years. I never threw it away. My father looked away. There was a shift in the air. A silence cracked open, and I became a witness to a story he had never told. When I was a kid, my dad used to say something always felt missing, I said, but he never explained what it was. Now I understand. That missing piece was you. Raymond took a deep breath. Sometimes, Evan, he said, life puts you somewhere between being remembered and being forgotten. And I stayed in that place for a very long time. The ferry was now nearing the shore. As it approached the dock, none of us spoke. We just waited, because some goodbyes demand silence. But this didn't feel like a goodbye. Raymond stood up. I don't know what happens next, he said, but this conversation, it helped me breathe again. My father rose as well. Then let's talk again, this time to finish the stories we left unfinished. And at that moment, I realized everything had changed. Because sometimes a ferry doesn't just carry people across the sea, it carries the weight of years from one shore to another. After stepping off the ferry, Raymond walked a few steps and then stopped. He turned back and looked at my father. There was a familiar light in his eyes, one that belonged to his youth. He reached into his pocket and slowly pulled out a worn wallet. Its leather was cracked, the corners frayed. With trembling fingers, he pulled out a photo and handed it to me. This is you, Evan, taken at the train station with your father. You were about 3 or 4. We went there that morning. That was the last time I ever saw your father. I looked at the photo. It really was me. My father looked young in his military uniform. He was holding my hand. I was smiling, but there was a shadow on his face. That day had actually been a farewell, and I was only learning that now. My father came us and looked at the photo. He let out a deep breath. I could never keep that photo, he said. Every time I saw it, it reminded me of a time I could never return to. But you kept it. Raymond lowered his head. I did, because it was the only thing I had left. We never made it back from that mission. Afterwards, no one asked about me. No one asked about you. I was alive, but off the record, erased, and so I stayed silent. My father grew quiet. He placed his hand on Raymond's shoulder. We stayed silent too, because we thought you were dead. After that day, no letter, no message. What died that day wasn't just my friend. A piece of me went with you. I stood between them, but in that moment, I felt invisible. This was a reckoning between two men and time itself. Every word carried a truth that had waited years to be spoken. Raymond slowly lifted his head. I don't want to run anymore, he said. If you'll have me, I'll come, I'll sit at your table, I'll tell my story, and I'll listen. My father nodded. There was a steady, unwavering look in his eyes. Come, Raymond, you're still part of our story, like an unfinished sentence. And this home has been waiting for you. That day, it wasn't just a photo that was handed over. A bond, long broken, was rebuilt. And I understood something deeply. Sometimes the past isn't carried in a wallet. It's kept in the heart. And Raymond was no longer just a memory. He was a story that had finally come home. On the drive home with Raymond in the car, no one spoke. My father drove slowly, his eyes not fixed on the road, but somewhere deep in the past. Raymond sat in the back seat, his hands clasped on his knees. His clothes were wrinkled, but his gaze was composed. The last person to see him in that house had been my mother. And now, after all these years, we were pulling up to the same front door. When my father turned off the ignition, he took a deep breath. "Are you ready?" he asked in a quiet voice. Raymond didn't reply, he only bowed his head. We opened the door. My mother, hearing our footsteps from the kitchen, called out, "Should I make some tea, Evan?" My father said nothing. At that moment, she appeared at the kitchen doorway and saw Raymond. The glass of tea in her hand slipped. It hit the floor and shattered, but she remained standing. Her eyes slowly rose to his face. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Only a whisper, "Ray?" Raymond lowered his head, just like he used to when he felt guilty in his younger days. "It's me," he said. My mother took a step back, steadying herself on the kitchen table. But then, unexpectedly, she stepped forward. She slowly reached out, touching Raymond's cheek. Her fingertips gently brushed against him, as if trying to remember a voice, a face lost in time. "They made a headstone for you," she said. "They wrote your name on the wall. For years I imagined you walking through that door. But no one ever believed me." Raymond's eyes filled with tears. "I imagined coming back too. But then I realized, sometimes returning isn't enough. You also need to be forgiven." My mother took his hands in hers. "We never needed to forgive you, Ray, because we never blamed you. We just stayed silent, because we had no other choice." My father stood behind us, watching them. Then he stepped forward, pulled out a chair. "Come on, Ray," he said. "You're not a guest here. You're someone we've been missing at this table." Raymond sat down. He placed his hands on the table. His fingers trembled. But it was as if that chair had been waiting for him all along. And I realized something. Some people return home after many years, but the true homecoming begins in the quiet of a kitchen with the touch of a mother's hand. And that day, our home felt complete again. At the table, silence lingered, broken only by the soft bubbling of the teapot. My mother replaced the broken glass with a new one, then offered Raymond a slice of cake. "This was your favorite," she said gently. Raymond thanked her, but didn't touch it. My father had his head slightly bowed, his eyes fixed on the tea in his cup. Everyone's mind was full, but no one rushed. Each word now weighed as much as years of silence. Raymond took a deep breath. "That day when we left headquarters, it felt like just another mission," he began. "I had no idea I'd never come back. When I stepped on the mine, I didn't just lose my leg, I lost my direction." My mother brought her hand to her mouth. My father still said nothing. When I woke up, I was in a different region, surrounded by a language I didn't speak, under a name that wasn't mine, a military hospital. Then I was transferred, and just like that, I was gone from all official records. My name didn't exist. I was a stranger. They didn't hide me so I'd forget the war. They hid me so I'd be erased by it. My father finally spoke without lifting his gaze from his tea. "I attended your funeral, Ray," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I swore an oath at an empty coffin. I thought I buried you. But all I buried was the friendship I held inside me." Raymond's eyes grew moist. "I remembered you every day. But when I was finally ready to come back, it felt too late, as if time had no room left for me." And then, for the first time, my father bowed his head. To see him that way was like watching a child see their father vulnerable, painful but deeply human. "You weren't too late, Ray," he said softly. "Maybe we were just too quick to forget, or we thought we had to." Raymond closed his eyes. He took a slow, steady breath. My mother gently placed a blanket beside him, wordlessly. It was an offering of peace, a quiet acceptance. And in that moment, I understood something. War doesn't just leave its scars on battlefields. It leaves them inside people too. But some wounds are healed in silence. And that night, after so many years, a man wasn't just returning home. He was beginning to return to himself. That night, no one turned on the TV. No one touched the radio. Even the clock in the living room seemed to tick more softly than usual. Raymond sat at the kitchen table, holding his glass tightly as he looked out the window. My father sat across from him, and this time they made eye contact. There was a shared weariness in their posture. One carried the shadow of war. The other bore the weight of guilt that had built up over the years. Without turning his head, Raymond spoke. "The day I came back, I realized I didn't belong anywhere. The uniform I wore had vanished. My name was erased from the records. But what really disappeared was the possibility that someone might still remember me. My father took a deep breath. "We looked for you everywhere," he said. But at some point, we stopped. Silence became part of the morning. Raymond turned his head. This time, his eyes met my father's directly. I know I never got to say goodbye, but inside, I lived that day 1,000 times. Our last conversation, the last look, and every time I wished I had said something else. My father nodded quietly. "Me too," he said, "because you were my best friend. And when I threw dirt over that empty coffin, something broke inside me." Raymond reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded photo. Old, worn, frayed at the edges. It was a photo of him and my father in their younger days, both in uniform, smiling. With trembling fingers, Raymond laid it gently on the table. "I carried this in my pocket for years. It was the only identity I had left." At that moment, my mother walked in from the back door. She was holding an old quilt. She draped it over Raymond's shoulders. "You're here now," she said softly, "and this house remembers you." I watched it all unfold without blinking. There was a warmth building in my chest and a lump in my throat. Because that night, it wasn't just a man who returned to our home. It was something that had been missing for years. And I understood something. Sometimes it takes a photo, sometimes a silence, sometimes just a look, to bring back what was lost to time. But most of all, it takes a home with space in its heart to help a war veteran finally feel like he belongs. The next morning, there was an unusual stillness around the breakfast table. Steam rose slowly from the cups of tea, and no one stirred a spoon. Raymond sat in the corner by the window. There was still a space between him and my father. But now it wasn't hostility that lingered there. It was silence waiting to be understood. My mother walked in from the kitchen, a basket of bread in her hands. She sat down at the table. For a while, no one spoke. Then gently and unexpectedly, she looked straight at Raymond and asked, "Did you ever look at our photo while you were there?" Raymond's hands froze. He slowly lifted his head. There was no surprise in his eyes, only a sorrow he had held back for years. "Every night," he said, "that photo was the only memory I had. It replaced a voice, a home, a past. Sometimes just looking at it reminded me who I was." My father shifted slightly in his seat. Until that moment, none of us had asked, where had Raymond been all those years? What had he lived through? And why now? Raymond lowered his gaze. "I was captured, but captivity isn't just fences and cells. Sometimes you're trapped in your own memory. They gave me a new name, taught me a new language. Everything was foreign, and then one day, a piece of paper found its way to me. Our photo, the moment I saw it, I remembered. Who I was, where I came from. That's when I decided I had to come back." Tears began to stream down my mother's face, but her voice didn't waver. "We never resented you, Raymond," she said. "Not once, but your absence. It taught us a lot. Maybe the hardest part of surviving wasn't the waiting. It was trying not to forget." Raymond reached into his pocket and pulled out the old, wrinkled photo. He placed it in the center of the table. My father, my mother, and I all leaned in at once. In the photo, my father and Raymond stood side by side, young, full of hope. Behind them, our home's old veranda. And in that moment, we realized it wasn't just a man we had lost for years. We had lost a piece of time. Because sometimes a photograph doesn't just bring back faces. It brings back everything they once carried. And that morning, we finally understood. Silence can sometimes speak the loudest truths. Raymond's old photograph still lay in the center of the table. The tea had gone cold, but no one had noticed. We were all drifting into the creases of that faded piece of paper, as if time itself was leaking out through them. Outside, life carried on, and somehow that same life had brought Raymond back to our table after all these years. That afternoon, my father stood up and said, "Let's go for a walk." Raymond nodded. The two of them stepped out together. I watched them from behind. I hadn't seen them walk side by side like that in a long time. Maybe never. My mother quietly slipped into the kitchen. I grabbed my coat and joined them. We walked toward the shore. When we reached the ferry dock, Raymond stopped. He fixed his eyes on the water. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "This isn't the Bosphorus. but it carries time the same way. My father smiled. That day, he said, we said our last goodbye as we boarded the ferry. After that, we never heard from you again. Raymond lowered his head. I remember. I clapped your back, spread my arms and said, you owe me a beer when we're back. Then everything went silent. When the ferry arrived, the three of us got on, but none of us sat down. We stood on the upper deck. The wind moved through our hair just as time seemed to move through our memories. Raymond reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn medallion. This belonged to your father, he said to mine. He gave it to me before our final mission, said, if I can't protect him, maybe this will. As my father took the medallion, his eyes welled up. He didn't speak for a while. Then he whispered, I always thought he died, but when I saw you, I realized you carried a part of him. Raymond nodded. I wasn't just his friend, I was his legacy. There we stood, three men on the ferry deck, surrounded by the past, the city behind us, the wind in front of us. And for the first time in a long while, everything felt in its place. And in that moment, I understood. Some paths bring you back to where you started, even after years. And with certain people, you don't reunite in words or farewells. You find them again in the quiet. By the time we stepped off the ferry, the sun was setting. The sky was painted in soft pastels, and the sea's surface had turned to glass. Raymond's steps had grown slower. My father gently took his arm, not so much to support him, but to walk alongside him. I followed a few steps behind, hovering at the edge of a feeling I didn't want to leave alone, yet didn't quite have the courage to face. We sat on a bench by the shore. Raymond took a deep breath. I always wanted to come back, he said, but I never knew where to return to. My father nodded. While we thought we lost you, turns out, you had lost yourself. Raymond turned his eyes to the sea. It hit me most during the nights. There were times I couldn't remember anyone's name, not even my own. But some voices never leave you. Yours, for example, when you used to give orders. My father smiled faintly. I never forgot your laughter either. Then came a long silence. The calls of distant birds, the hum of a passing boat. They were all background noise. The true sound was the echo of spaces that the past had carved out inside us. Raymond reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out an old letter, creased, yellowed, fragile. This was the last letter he wrote, he said. I never mailed it, never even opened it, but I carried it with me, always. My father took the envelope in his hands. His eyes trembled as he read the handwriting. To my son, if this letter ever reaches you, know that I love you. He couldn't read any further. He closed the envelope and placed his hand on Raymond's shoulder. You brought us many things, he said, but most of all, you brought back his voice. Raymond closed his eyes. I wasn't his voice, he whispered, but maybe I was its echo. In that moment, I realized no one in this story had simply gone missing. We had all forgotten something, and we had all, at some point, been forgotten. But now on one bench sat three men, one who came from the past, one who carried it, and one who sat quietly, writing it all down. And right then, the final sentence of our story revealed itself to me. Some journals don't close with words. They close in silence. But before they close, every word inside them is worth a lifetime.